All right, so in this video, I'm going to do a walkthrough of how to solve assignment two, how I would solve it if I were at this point in my programming knowledge, having mastered the content from the first 2 weeks of the course. Now, I want to be clear that this is not necessarily the best way to solve it or the only way to solve it. This is just how I would solve it. Though there are going to be a lot of things I'll point out that you may want to take note of that may help you in the future. So, first of all, if you've looked at the feedback on the rubrics or on the assignment rubrics that I've given, you'll notice that I will always dock points for not matching the output. The program output always needs to match. And I always, if it's like a minor formatting thing, I always give you the opportunity to resubmit. Just email me or ping me on Slack once you've done it so I can update the grade. But precision in the output of a program is super important because often there are other programs downstream or other modules that depend on the exact formatting. So learning to get in the habit of getting that right and being precise with that is important. There are also principles that we're teaching a lot of times with how the format is structured. And so we want to make sure that all of those come through. So again, not trying to be super persnickety or anything, but the output does need to match what is in the example program. So no worries if you didn't get that exactly right. Just go back, fix it up, send me an email. I'll update the grade. All right, so let's look at the instructions here. So it's really important to know the exact expectations. So for this assignment, create a simple bill calculator similar to what's used in a restaurant to determine the amount to charge a customer. It adds tax and a tip to the subtotal. Use the following requirements. Ask the user for the subtotal. Ask the user for the tip percentage, showing the value, including the tax. Calculate the total and print a breakdown to the user. Use a constant value of 6% for the sales tax to calculate the tax. Add the tax to the subtotal. Calculate the tip amount. Display the cost breakdown. So one of the things that you can do when you are working on a complicated problem is instead of just like free forming it and just trying to figure it all out, you can just copy this stuff here, paste it in. So there's a little shortcut you can do. You can highlight all this, edit, advanced, and toggle line comment. And that'll just turn all of those instructions into a comment. Okay. So we're going to then just put this over here like this. Okay, so these are my instructions. And this is exactly what I want to do in the program. So I'll indent this the way it's indented over there in the instructions so that I know how this matches up. Okay, now the reason I do this is because then I can solve each of these steps kind of algorithmically one at a time and test each part. So step one, ask the user for the subtotal amount. All right, so I know how to do that. I'm going to say right line, and I'm going to just copy and paste right from the instructions. Enter the subtotal amount. And we are going to be entering it on the next line, so I don't need to do any kind of spacing or anything here. And I'm going to create a string, and I'm just going to keep reusing the same variable, answer, because I'm always going to, anything they type in, I'm going to convert to another variable. So I'll just use answer for everything. So answer equals read line. And then the subtotal amount, it's going to be, here they're using an integer, but I know that it could be a float, okay? So I could use a float, I could use a double, I could use a decimal. Since we're dealing with money, I'll go ahead and use a decimal number. And I'll say convert to decimal, answer, like that. Okay, now I do need to give this variable a name, so I'm going to call this subtotal. Then step two, ask the user for the tip percent. So once again, I'm just going to reuse answer. Notice that when I do this, I don't have to redeclare the type. I don't write string here because I've already created this variable. I'm just using it again as temporary storage. Because again, to walk through this, we are reading from the console what the user types and storing it here. Then we're taking what's stored here and converting it and storing that converted value here. Once I do that, I don't need what's in answer anymore. So I'm just going to reuse it to temporarily hold the next input. So for this input, we want to ask enter the tip percentage for, and then our subtotal. So right now, I'm going to say enter the tip percent for, and then ... So I'll just leave that blank right now because I want to make sure that all the rest of this works before I worry about the formatting. And then we are going to store our tip. Now, this is a tip percentage, so we don't necessarily need to store it as a decimal, but to keep all the math easy, keep everything the same type, I'm going to do that. So I'm going to call this tip percent equal to convert to decimal answer. Okay. Now, we're going to have to do one other thing to this, but we'll get there in a minute. I just want to run this and make sure everything works as we expect so far. Enter the subtotal amount, and I'm just going to use for right now the inputs that are in the example. Enter the tip percentage for ... Okay, and that all seems to be working. And if I want to double check, I can put a breakpoint in here, and then when I run this, I can type in those percentages, step over that line, and I can look at tip percent, see it's 15. I can see that I can also check down here that subtotal is 21. They're both decimals. Notice I only have one answer variable, and it's 15 right now because we reused it to store that input the second time. All right, so let's go ahead and work on the formatting here. So if you read the text, you know there are a bunch of different things to think about for formatting, and there are a few different ways we can do this. So first of all, I'm going to use interpolation. So I'm going to put a $sign here so that I can just insert variables into this string. And I'm going to just put in subtotal. Okay, so let's see how that looks. If I run that, 21, and it's exactly what I type. But let's say I type $21.49. Okay, that looks pretty good. But we might want to format that to look like money. So I'm going to use a format specifier here. Run that one more time. 21. And notice that no matter what the user types in, the format specifier of C for currency, which I think the book mentioned, if not, there was a link to it, automatically inserts the $sign, the decimal point, and rounds it to 2 decimal places. There are other ways we could do this. We could do it like this instead. We could put a $sign explicitly and write float 2 so that we have a floating point number formatted to 2 decimals. But by using currency instead, we get the localized currency conversion. So if this program were running in the UK, it would use a UK pound sign. If it were running in France, it would use a euro sign. And if it were running in a country where they use commas instead of decimal points to mark the coins, to mark the decimal dollars or decimal currency, it would use the correct specifier, the correct delimiter there. So that's why we use C for currency format, and it'll localize it to wherever the program's being run. All right, so we have that. I want to call out how I'm naming variables and also the breakup here. So I've talked about this before, but notice how I'm breaking up the code based on idea. It's like a paragraph, so I have a blank line in between each one. This just makes it easier to read. When you add the fact that I've got these comments here that tell you exactly what this block of code is doing, it makes it really easy if there's a problem with the program to pinpoint, especially if we get into programs with hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of lines of code. It makes it really easy to figure out where things are going wrong. Okay, I also want to call out just how I'm naming the variables. So subtotal, tip percent, these are both using camel case. So subtotal is a single word, so you don't notice that. Tip percent, though, notice how the first word is lowercase and the second word and any subsequent words are uppercase. And you'll notice this is to distinguish it from function names where we have uppercase, uppercase. Here we start with lowercase and then every subsequent word is uppercase. So that is called camel case formatting. It's a very common format. It's not the only format you'll see. And the general rule of thumb is that when you work for a big organization, they will usually have what's called a style guide telling you how to name things and format things properly. and you'll want to adhere to whatever that is. But camel case is a pretty popular one, so you'll see it quite a lot. All right, so let's go ahead and calculate the next part. So it says to use a constant value of 6% for the sales tax. Now, we could do this a couple of different ways. First of all, I could write decimal tax rate equals 0.06. Notice when I do this, I'll get a little red squiggle here that tells me, hey, this is a double, and you can't store a double in a decimal. I could convert this to a double if I wanted, but I want to keep everything decimal just for consistency. So we talked before about how you can say explicitly that something's a float by using the letter F. Well, we can say something is currency or decimal by using the letter M. So if I highlight over that, you'll see that it is now a decimal. Now, tax rate I have declared as a variable here, but technically this is a constant. So it's something that's never going to change. So I can make sure it never changes by typing the word const in front of the variable type. If I do that, and then later in the program, I accidentally try to change the tax rate to 70%, it will give me an error and say you can't change this constant value. Now, an even better way to do this is to format this so that it's more obviously a constant. And usually the way we format constants are in uppercase with underscores between the words. And most often we will put the constants at the top of the program. So if we have a bunch of different constants, they'll all be up here, and it's easy to change those and affect how the program runs without hunting through the code to find all the places that they might be declared. They're all just declared at the top. So it's pretty common to declare a constant at the top. So we have a constant value of 6% for the sales tax. So our sales tax amount, we'll say sales tax is going to be equal to the tax rate times the subtotal. That's going to be our tax. And then this line, this is an interesting one. So this is the sum of the subtotal and the tax, but it doesn't have a name. And so I am not going to store that calculation. I'm just going to print it once I'm done with all my other calculations. So let's go ahead and what I'm actually going to do, notice the display parts at the bottom. So I'm going to do all the calculations I care about, and then I will do this later. All right, so add the tax to the subtotal. So that's what this is. So I'm going to ignore that for now. You can certainly create another variable to use, subtotal plus tax, some of you used, but I'm going to skip that. All right, so I'm going to skip that and come down here, calculate the tip amount by multiplying the tip percentage by the amount in part B. So the tip percentage we are entering as an integer, but we want to treat it like a percent. So since I've converted it to a decimal, I'm going to go ahead up here, and there are a couple ways I could do this. I could divide it by 100 right here, but instead I'm going to do it on a separate line. I'm going to say tip percent is equal to whatever it was before divided by 100. Okay? Now I have to be careful here because if I do it like this is integer division. Okay? So I have to put the 0.0 here. Now if I do, it says, hey, you're using a double and you're dividing a decimal by a double, and you can't do that. So I have to say, okay, I'm dividing a decimal by a decimal. And so now if they type in 15, it'll be converted to 0.15 and stored back into this variable. Okay? So now I have my sales tax. I guess I should write sales tax. And I've got my subtotal and my tip percentage all still as decimal. And I'm going to run this just up to this point to make sure everything looks how I expect. So I have 21 for the subtotal. I have 15 for my tip percentage. And if I look, tip percentage is now 0.15 because it got converted on this line, on line 23. And then if I look at my sales tax amount, if I skip ahead one step, I can see sales tax is $1.26, which is exactly what I expect. All right, so let's go on to this next part, part C. Calculate the tip amount by multiplying the tip percentage by the amount in part B. So I can now say tip amount is going to be equal to the tip percent multiplied by, and it's going to be the tax plus the subtotal. Make sure you use the sales tax amount, not the tax rate. And if it's not clear, you can just change this to say tax amount. and maybe that will be more obvious. So tip amount, this way we're consistent with tip amount. So we have tax amount is equal to the tax rate times the subtotal. Tip amount is equal to the tip percentage times the result of adding subtotal and tax amount together. Okay, so that gives us our tip amount. And then part D, we're going to display everything. So let's go ahead and start displaying things. So first of all, we need to display this little header. And I'm just going to make sure I get the exact length here by copying that. And I will say right line. That. All right, now I'm going to just put everything in without doing any formatting, and then we'll format it later. So I'm going to put our $sign there. This is our subtotal amount. Make sure we spell that right. And then we have our tax at 6%. And then tax amount. And then we're going to have nothing, and then our part B. So I'm going to, this is a kind of a neat little shortcut you can do, because remember I said I didn't want to store part B in its own variable. So this is just subtotal plus tax amount. It's going to end up right there. Then we're going to write tip, and then I'm going to put the tip percent, colon, and we will put our tip amount. And then we have this same string of dashes right there. And then at the very end, we have our total, and we are going to put the total. Now, the total, I could do it like I did here, subtotal plus tax amount, subtotal plus tax amount plus tip amount, but I'm going to go ahead and calculate the total. So I'll just put that here. Decimal total is going to be equal to the subtotal plus the tax amount plus the tip amount. You could do it either way. And we'll put the total right here. All right, let's run that and see, make sure all of our calculations work as we expect. So 21 and 15. Okay, so our subtotal is 21. Our tax is $1.26. Then we've got this 22.26, tip 15%, 3.34 once you round, total 25.60 once we round. So now let's get all our formatting correct. So first of all, I want to make sure all of these are formatted as currency if they are dollar amounts. And let's go ahead and run that. So subtotal amount 21, tip amount 15. Okay, so all of these are correct. Now notice here on line 38, so on the left side of the colon, this is what I'm going to display, and I'm going to display two things that are added together. So we can put any calculation we want in a format string. It's kind of a fun little shortcut. And then specify that we want the result formatted as currency. All right, so tip percent. So for tip percent, taking advantage of the fact that we can do that, there are a couple things we could do. So one thing is we could do P 4%, run that. So we'll run 21, 15, okay? And we see that we have 15.00%, but in our output, we don't want any decimals. So I'm gonna put P0. This works just like F for floating point, where we can specify the exact number of decimal places. So putting that in like that, P0, I have a percent formatted with 0 decimal places, okay? All right, so now I need to figure out exactly how to get everything to line up properly. So there are a bunch of different ways to tackle formatting. And how exactly is the best way is going to depend on a couple of things. First of all, in our case, all of our variable things are on the right, and then our constant things are on the left, with the exception of tip, which we'll handle in a special way in a minute. But these are all constant widths, and these are going to be variable widths. And so the way we can handle this is we want to make sure everything is lined up on the left side. So what I mean by that is I want to make sure that if there is variable, that variable interpolation starts in the same location every time. So I'm going to put spaces in to make sure that those interpolation values we'll ignore tip for a minute because we're gonna have to do that one differently. All of these line up just like that. Okay. Now that's only half of the problem because if I run this, I will see that we look good here and ignoring tip, everything lines up, but it's not lining up the way the output does. The output says everything needs to be aligned to the right. So now the question is, how wide do I make this number column? And what I want to do is say, all right, I've got subtotal, which takes up a certain amount. And notice that this is shifted over. So I'm just going to put a space here for a second. So subtotal takes up this much room, and then I've got a space, and then I've got this many characters, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 little dashes. So I want this number column, the amount of space here, to be 9 and everything aligned to the right. So for example, if this is 5 characters wide or 6 characters wide, I want there to be 3 blank spaces in front of it. And this one, I want 3 blank spaces. And this one is only 5 spaces, 5 characters. So I want 4 blank spaces. And I can get the computer to calculate all of that for me just by telling me, hey, the amount of space taken up by this should be 9 spaces. And it will figure out how many blank spaces to put in. Now, the reason I shifted this over was just so that all the quotes would line up because I don't have a dollar sign in front of these. And so I just wanted to be able to count those. I'll just put that back. So we have our alignment, our column width specifier, which goes to the left of our format specifier. So we have comma, the width, then colon, and the format. And actually, I'm going to leave the tip line alone still, so we'll handle that later. Okay, so run that. Type in our amounts. Okay, and now everything is lined up on the right. So again, what happened here was we said, okay, our text comes out at most this far. There are 9 spaces left. And so I want the number column to take up 9 spaces. So the computer figures out, all right, this is how big that number is going to be once we apply the formatting to it. And so it knows how many blank spaces to put in front of it. So it figures all of that out for us. Now we have to handle tip percentage differently because it has 2 variables that we have to worry about the spacing for. So first of all, let's just go ahead and see what happens if we put this with a column width of 9, like we did the other columns, okay? So when we do this, we notice we're off by 1. And the reason is tip 15% doesn't take up the same amount of space as subtotal does. All the other rows, we added extra spaces for this, but since we have a variable here, we can't do that. And so for this row, we're going to have to say that this column is going to be formatted 10 wide. So if we run this, let me shrink that back. And do 21 and 15 again. Now that's lined up and everything looks good. And this will continue to look good unless we decide we're really cheap and we're only going to pay a single digit tip percentage, let's say 8%. Now our alignment's off again. So this is the problem with this line. Again, we've got 2 different variables we have to worry about. So the way we fix this is we create an alignment or a width for the tip percent column as well. So we know that normally we have 15 here. So if I run this with 15 as the tip percentage, my tip normally takes up 3 spaces. And so all I have to do is say that I want the tip column to be 3 spaces wide. When I do that, even if I do a single digit tip, everything still lines up over here. Now I do have this extra space after the word tip, which I don't love, but we can live with that for now. All right, so just want to review a couple of things. First of all, read over this and copied the instructions, the algorithmic instructions here, turned them all into comments by using edit, advanced, toggle line comment. That turned every line to a comment, which I then indented to match the indentation here. Then I solved each piece of this, one after the other, sometimes stopping to test to make sure it worked right. Our tax rate we wrote as a constant using a different format for the name, all uppercase with underscores in between, put it at the top of the program. All our variables we named using camel case, starting with a lowercase letter. We did the calculations as needed. Here, there wasn't really something clever to name this, and so instead of calculating what it was when I added the tax to the subtotal, I just dropped that directly into our format string. And speaking of the format strings, I did not bother formatting everything till I was sure we had all of the output at the end, and then made sure all the calculations were correct. And then I went through and figured out the alignments and format specifiers. Okay. So that's just a good general practice to go through. We always want to make sure the output matches the specified output exactly, because that's important. I'll talk more about why that's important next week. But the other thing is that we structured the program in blocks, logical blocks based on the smaller problems we are trying to solve. So this is a really good example of how we approach programming. If I were to say, hey, create a bill calculator, make sure it takes into account tips and subtotals. Instead, we said, okay, I know I need to do this. I know I need to do this and do this and do this and do this and do this. We solve each piece. We put it all together at the end, work out any bugs, figure out the alignment, etc. All right. So again, this is not the way to do it or the best way to do it. It's just a way to do it. Now, granted, I've been programming for a long time, so it's a pretty good way to do it. So if your way was drastically different, you may want to compare this and see what was different and why, and make sure you understand what I've done here. And if you have any questions, just ask on Slack.